51 days to Brexit, and yet the UK Parliament's about to spend 34 of them in recess. Only a week after returning from summer break, the Prime Minister closing shop after failing a second time round in his bid for an early snap general election. Boris Johnson defying Parliament's passage of a bill to stop the government from crashing out of the EU without a deal, insisting there will be no delay, while the mood in the chamber turned ugly. Yeah, it's a chance of traitor, Johnson going out of the chamber. Johnson, whose people versus parliament strategy, will it work when that general election finally does come? Where does it all leave the world's longest-running democracy? On the day the president-elect of the European Commission unveiled her lineup, we'll be asking about what perils in Britain's current crisis for the rest of the continent. Today in the France 24 debate, are we headed straight for no deal? And joining us from London, Leave supporter Simon Breuer is the CEO and director of Vantage Investment. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you very much. Merci. Bonjour.
Bonjour to Duncan FAIRGRIEVE, professor of comparative law at the University of Paris Dauphine. And we might need some legal advice during this show. With us as well, economist Rémi BOURGEOT. He's an associate fellow at the think tank Iris. Thanks for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It was 1:44 a.m. local time. The Speaker of the House of Commons returns after notification by the House of Lords that Parliament is to be prorogued. All but a handful of Conservatives stayed to shake John Bercow's hand on the day the Speaker had earlier announced he'd be stepping down at the end of the month. When he took act of the prorogation, the Speaker spoke up.
I had made the point, that people have the manners to listen, which they haven't, that order that I will play my part. This is not, however, a normal prorogation. It is not typical. It is not standard. It's one of the longest for decades, and it represents, not just in the minds of many colleagues, but huge numbers of people outside, an act of executive fiat.
What is executive fiat? Just explain that to us.
Well, I think what the Speaker was referring to there was the fact that the executive has tried to impose their will on Parliament, and the general feeling is that the prorogation was not really for the reasons that the government say it is for, which is to allow for the Queen's speech to occur, but really to reduce the debate and scrutiny that normally should occur in relation to the government during this period.
So John Bercow, the Speaker of Parliament, a folk hero for some and a villain for others, being too much, they say, of an activist speaker. Was he? Or is he rather? He's still the Speaker till the end.
Still is until the 31st of October. I mean, I think it depends on your viewpoint. I mean, he certainly has tried to reassert the privileges of Parliament in a period where we've seen a constitutional battle between the executive trying to impose their viewpoint and Parliament reasserting themselves, as has happened in the last 10 days. So I think the Constitution's under a huge amount of stress, and the Speaker's had to stand up to his role.
Has had to stand up to his role because Boris Johnson is testing constitutional limits?
I'm not just referring actually to the current administration. I'm referring actually to what's occurred over the last 3 years. I mean, the British Constitution has been under a huge amount of stress. The stress test hasn't been fantastic, to be honest. We've seen that they've been pushed to the limits, and I think the last 10 days has certainly been a culmination of a process which has been occurred over the last 3 years.
So, Simon Breuer, why then suspend Parliament, prorogue it for the longest period since 1945?
Well, yes, I think just further to what the other speaker said is that the Speaker, Bercow, has implemented a series of almost unprecedented moves prior to what's happened this week. So it would be difficult to describe his actions as impartial. Hence the sort of the division of views about him. But I think Boris Johnson taking up the mantle from Theresa May's, I suppose one could easily say, lamentable lack of negotiation is trying to bring this to a head, because the basic dilemma continues, is that MPs voted for the referendum. They voted to invoke Article 50, and nearly all of them stood, not Liberals, but all the others, stood on manifestos to execute the wishes of the majority following the referendum. And now, of course, we've reached this impasse. So he is trying to push it. He clearly is. He is standing for, and one can, I think, rightly interpret it as a view that the people need to be represented, and they aren't being represented for all the reasons that we're aware of in the current state and the current impasse. So these are unusual times, if not abnormal times, and they call for abnormal measures. But prorogation, has all sorts of precedents, and so, in the scheme of what's happened in the last few years, it's not illegal, and it can't be considered to be so abnormal given the backdrop.
But Simon, do you think that Parliament should be in session at this crucial moment in the build-up to October 31st?
I think the Parliament has been unable to make progress on this issue since we began, and since Mrs. May set out her red lines, which she then gave up upon, and the rest that followed, with her ultimate demise. So no, I think we've got to a stage where if the MPs in aggregate are unwilling to allow Boris Johnson to negotiate, and for any effective negotiation you have to be prepared to walk away. If that isn't going to be allowed, then I think we have to have this period of your reflection will come back. Johnson's policies will be put with the Queen's speech, and I imagine we'll have an election shortly afterwards.
Rémi BOURGEOT, we've had 3 years of stalemate. You heard the argument there from Simon Breuer, which is, well, if you want to have a breakthrough, you have to stake out a bargaining position. Do you see Boris Johnson's point?
Yeah, well, he does have a strategy which is really in turmoil at this time, but his strategy consists in getting very close to a no-deal exit.
Running the clock.
Yes, and some European governments are really concerned about the possibility of no-deal Brexit, especially the German government, which is willing to reopen a kind of renegotiation with Boris Johnson, even on the issue of the Irish backstop. It's not the case, of course, of all European governments, especially the French government's very much opposed to that kind of renegotiation. And many governments have taken some measures to, in case the no-deal Brexit does happen, but most of them are really afraid that it might happen. So Boris Johnson's strategy does make some sense, but obviously it's very hard to enact that strategy in the context of this political chaos in Westminster. So it's kind of desperate strategy, really, towards the Parliament, at least. His strategy does make sense in terms of European negotiations. The thing is really, and from the beginning of those talks, for about 3 years, really has been this chaos, this political division in British society, which is really preventing Britain to develop a really coherent, consistent strategy towards with the European Union.
All right, so what happens next? Well, Brexit, if you believe Boris Johnson.
If you really want to delay Brexit beyond October the 31st, which is what you seem to want to do, then vote for an election and let the people decide. Let the people decide if they want to delay or not. And if you refuse to do that tonight, then I will go to Brussels. Our government will go to Brussels on October the 17th and negotiate our departure on the 31st of October. hopefully with a deal, Mr. Speaker, but without one if necessary. I will not ask for another delay.
Barrister Duncan FAIRGRIEVE, this is the question everyone in the newsroom's been asking. Can he do that?
Well, I think he's boxed himself in. Actually, I mean, it's just
can
bluster.
He, when he says, you say it's bluster, but can he just run the clock? There was that measure passed by Parliament.
He's under a statutory obligation. I mean, it's very clear.
Yeah, but can he just go to them? Can he just go to them and say, "Look, I tried and I failed at the last minute"?
He's under a statutory obligation now since last night, passing of the law, to ask for an extension if he has not secured a deal.
That's not what he says there, though. This is after the vote. This is after that vote. He's saying October 31st, come what may.
Boris Johnson, says one thing and the contrary from day to day. So, I mean, he's not known for his consistency. And legal obligations are firm. And I don't think there are any loopholes here. So he has a choice. I mean, he either secures a deal in the next few weeks, or he will have to follow the law. That is the primary obligation of government ministers. If he doesn't do that, then
talk us through that.
I mean, I'm not denying what we just heard, not denying what the sort of briefings that are occurring in London, but it's extremely serious. We shouldn't underestimate the difficulty, the constitutional difficulties, even in suggesting suggestions made
talk us through it. What are the recourses if he decides that come what may, they're leaving October 31st, and if we wake up on the morning of November 1st and Britain is out of the EU without a deal, what happens?
The legal questions are following. We now have legislation which has been through the process, which is on the statute books, which says that in that scenario he has to ask for an extension until the 31st of January. So that is an obligation, and if he says he's not going to follow that obligation, there are ways of pursuing that. But that can be enforced. But we shouldn't be in a position.
How can it be enforced?
Just to get to that point, we shouldn't be in a position at all about having a debate about whether a government minister, prime minister, is going to follow legal obligations or not. I mean, that is the basic principle of the rule of law. And the fact the ministers are suggesting and turning around the pin in relation to those obligations is quite frankly outrageous. It's undermining the rule of law. Now, he may choose to, maybe that is his strategy. His next strategy is to pick a fight with the judges. In other words, he may want to go to the point where he refuses to satisfy those obligations, in which case it will play out before the courts. And the question is, how will that work? Well, I think probably what will occur is there will be an attempt to get an injunction to ensure that someone is mandated to address the letter which is requesting the extension as required under the legislation. I mean, that's. And
can it all happen before October 31st?
Oh, that can. I mean, that's not that can happen very quickly. I mean, it's a statutory obligation which can be enforced in the courts very quickly. That's not an issue. The timing's not an issue. I mean, I hope that they come to their senses, this administration, and realise that they are. And clearly recognise that they are a country which respects the rule of law, and therefore that they make it clear that they will follow those obligations. But I take your point. It's not at all clear. There are contrary suggestions, and that is undermining the standing of the UK. It's undermining the rule of law, and it's not a good thing for the constitution setup of the UK.
Simon Breuer. Should Boris Johnson, in this case, if we follow Duncan's logic here, break the law and keep that promise that he made? Come what may, he's leaving October 31st.
So I suspect, he's a very intelligent individual with a great understanding of history, and he may have a whiff of Cromwell and Churchill about him, but I would be surprised if he did. But I think he will be very persuasive if he goes to the UK populace and says that he was essentially legally disallowed by Parliament from walking away from a negotiation, which is the position in which he's been put. So I think that he will obey the law, and I think that his message to the people will resonate, and we will see. But I suspect that that'll be the outcome, and I suspect that the frustration at the inability of parliamentarians to follow the result of the referendum, will be decisive.
Except that the rest of this month, if you look at the calendar, Simon, it's those party conferences, and we're going to see plenty of grandstanding and, more importantly, plenty of political brinkmanship during that period. Again, do you think he'll stick to the letter of the law?
Yeah, so look, I mean, anybody who pronounces certainty about the outcomes is dreaming, because this is a highly uncertain position in which we find ourselves, and the outcomes are nothing more than best guesses, etc. And the brinkmanship at the party levels, well, we know what the Liberals stand for. They've been consistent. They're Remainers. Labour's position has been laughable, and I think people in the wider populace understand Corbyn's essential distrust of the EU, and yet not having had a position now suddenly wants us to stay in the EU and tells us that he could be an effective negotiator, which, I think is the irony of which is not lost on some people. So no, to answer your question, I don't think Boris Johnson will break the law.
You don't think Boris Johnson will break the law? When we come back in the France 24 debate, we're going to take a look at how this is playing out across the channel and how it will play out. Of course, at one point, there will be that Brussels summit that's taking place before Brexit is due to happen at the end of October. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
The world is ever changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what, France 24 is with you everywhere, all the time.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
In 2013, Edward Snowden's explosive revelations made him the most wanted man in the world.
Honestly, I was terrified. I was so scared.
He was helped in his Hong Kong hideout by a group of asylum seekers at great risk to themselves.
Every single minute we are in danger.
They know how life in Hong Kong or my country.
Si les anges gardiens de Snowden se font déporter, ils retournent en enfer.
Don't miss our exclusive report about the people who put themselves on the line to defend the values of freedom.
Please protect these families.
Reporters presented by Mark Owen on France 24 and France24.com.
Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day on Info Migrants' website, we fight fake news spread on social networks about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Lois Cillier is watching for you in the newsroom. Donald Trump dismissing his third national security advisor, John Bolton, out of sync with an isolationist U.S. president, the hawkish Bolton, who had broken with Trump, it seems, over issues like Iran, but also more recently Afghanistan. The last straw, says South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham. Benjamin Netanyahu vows to annex the West Bank's Jordan Valley if re-elected. Israel's incumbent prime minister in a tight race 1 week ahead of a snap general election. Promotions and rejig job descriptions, the incoming lineup of European commissioners unveiled by President-elect Ursula Von Der Leyen. Already France's nominee in hot water, Sylvie Goulard, questioned by police in a party financing probe. Michael Schumacher in a Paris hospital, the Formula One legend, who's not been seen as public since his coma-inducing skiing accident back in 2013, reportedly in the care of a stem cell specialist. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. With Parliament prorogued in the UK, we're looking at the countdown to Brexit and at Boris Johnson's strategy. With us to talk about it is Simon Breuer, who's CEO and director of Vantage Investment and a supporter of the Leave camp. Duncan FAIRGRIEVE is professor of comparative law at the University of Paris Dauphine, and economist Rémi BOURGEOT, associate fellow at the French political science think tank IRIS. Back in April, the Hansard Society, that's a parliamentary affairs think tank, put out its latest survey that it does regularly on attitudes to governing in the UK. It turns out 54% of Britons say they need a strong leader who's willing to break the rules. 2/3 of the public think politicians should be able to say what's on their mind, regardless of anyone else thinks about their views. And then the public evenly split, Rémi BOURGEOT, between those who say they are ready to make compromises with people they disagree with, and those who prefer politicians that stick to their positions. The country is split over that one. But let's go back to that first point. 54% say Britain needs a strong leader who's willing to break the rules. As a Frenchman looking at the world's oldest parliamentary democracy, your reaction to that?
I assume it's to break the rules in order to enact Brexit. I'm not sure really what that means, but.
By the way, there was a similar survey here in France before the election in 2017 that the French wanted a strong leader.
Well, especially in the case of Brexit, I mean, anyone can really understand that negotiations are really facing a dead end. Because of the division, both in Britain and also in Europe. European leaders do not agree at all on the way to deal with Brexit. And in the end, no real negotiations has really happened. And this deal that was really prepared before the first deadline of March 2019 was also had many flaws, and it was obvious it would not really be accepted by the British Parliament either. So this is really complicated, and I think the public really understands that there's this deadlock, and no Prime Minister is really in a position to negotiate such a complex in such a complex situation. It's just impossible. And at some point, I mean, there's a kind of exhaustion also on the European side, and the German government is in favor of renegotiating something, or at least making some concessions. So it's likely that Boris Johnson will resign if he doesn't really manage to get anything that can be presented as a new deal.
Resign, but we may see him back after a general election if he does. Simon Breuer. We saw last week those conservative Remainer MPs who crossed the aisle, people signaling perhaps the end of the Conservative Party as a big tent that was welcome to all sorts of varying positions. Instead, and this is in line again with what we saw in that survey, Boris Johnson taking the position that he'd rather have a smaller, more hardcore, if you will, Conservative Party. Your thoughts on what that's going to do to Britain's democracy?
Well, I just want to go back to the first point, the point just made that there was almost no way in which a negotiation could have been carried out effectively, and I disagree with that. I think that when history judges Theresa May, they will say the failure was not to try to negotiate in good faith while simultaneously preparing every inch of the way for those 2+ years for no deal, at which point the passage if no deal had occurred, would have been infinitely smoother than it would be if it happens on October 31st. And that was unforgivable, and it was weak, and it was, immensely hypocritical after her so-called red lines speech that she'd made, at the outset, and no deal better being than a bad deal, because many of us couldn't see the merits of staying in the EU, and there is a strong argument, as some of us have espoused, of leaving, but there was little to recommend the agreement that finally was constructed. So I think, to answer your point about the Conservative Party, I don't think this is an existential moment for the party. I would not be surprised if come the next election there isn't a way in which those 21 MPs are brought back on side. But I think it's been the absence of strong leadership that has forced some of these changes and forced a more muscular approach that Boris Johnson has taken, but I do not think that it's the end.
But has Boris Johnson and his political advisor Dominic Cummings just made the come to the conclusion that look, it's too splintered UK politics. We'll never get compromise inside one party now with all these people. Better to go after those voters who might be tempted by Nigel Farage's Brexit party and stake out a hardcore position.
Well, yeah, I think that this is quite clear that Cummings, having run the Vote Leave campaign, with Boris Johnson, wants to get closure on this. And whether we see an electoral pact with Nigel Farage or not is, unknowable at this stage. But UK politics has been in a position of indecisiveness ever since we joined the EU. And I think it was de Gaulle who said it, is that, why did he reject Britain's entry initially? It was that he said that Britain would sit uneasily in that EU construct, and he was right. And, and today we're seeing, the ongoing conflict and unwillingness, which is why we need to get closure.
You agree with this, Duncan FAIRGRIEVE? This is a pendulum swing, and, well, it'll swing back to times when the UK was an island of moderation.
I partly agree with what Simon just said, but I mean, it's not the UK that has had a difficult relationship with Europe. It's the Conservative Party, and what has occurred now is the Conservative Party have managed to project that ongoing internal debate onto the whole country. Basically, it's brought down its own internal warfare has now become a nationwide issue.
There is an element
with all the
of
effects
internal,
we see.
There is an element of internal warfare, if you will, within the Labour Party over this now as well.
I mean, the Labour Party have also had different viewpoints, but they haven't projected it onto the country in the way that, in an actually catastrophic way, the Conservative Party have done. And just back to the point about strong leadership, which was meant earlier on, I mean, we just see what the result of strong leadership has come to pass. We have 6 votes in Parliament which have been lost by the Prime Minister.
Out of 6.
We have out of 6. We have a loss of his slender majority, but loss of his majority. He has excluded some of those senior members from his party. He has lost his brother as a minister and an MP. I mean, it's absolutely catastrophic.
He looked at the results of those European elections where the Conservatives finished in single digits and thought, I got to clean house before an election.
I mean, it's a scorched earth policy. I think that's what Cummings is trying to do. I mean, I think it's. I don't think it's I think it's a policy they will come to regret. But the problem is the Conservative Party are going to regret it, but the UK is suffering the consequences of that policy. Personally, I think rather than grandstanding on the national stage, Boris Johnson needs to do, as Prime Minister, what he said he would do, which is actually try and negotiate a deal. He said that it was 1 in a million chance during his leadership campaign that there'll be a no deal. He's now got to get out and make concrete proposals, as he agreed with the European leaders over 2 weeks ago, and actually try and sort out the mess, because that I think is the only way out of this impasse. Is for him to actually do what he said he would do. He preferred a deal to be negotiated. He's got to actually negotiate that. And we've heard from the European leaders that is not occurring at the moment. They're waiting for his proposals. And it's an absolute scandal that he's not actually doing that.
Let's talk about that. If the UK is not out by October 31st, it'll have to contend with a new team in Brussels. This Tuesday saw the president-elect of the European Commission, whose mandate begins November the 1st, unveil her lineup of commissioners for the next 5 years. Her team includes, by the way, Ireland's Phil Hogan, promoted from agriculture to trade. Trade, you know, that portfolio that's in charge of negotiating future trade deals. The announcement comes a day after Boris Johnson visited Dublin, where his hosts asked for, yes, concrete proposals.
Prime Minister, negotiating FTAs with the EU and the US and securing their ratification in less than 3 years, I think is going to be a Herculean task for you. But we do want to be your friend and your ally, your Athena in doing so. I am ready to listen to any constructive ways in which we can achieve our agreed goals and resolve the current impasse. But what we cannot do and will not do, and I know you understand this, is agree to the replacement of a legal guarantee with a promise.
Rémi BOURGEOT?
Yeah, I think there's really a great deal of confusion about what Brexit can really be like, and about a no-deal exit also. I mean, most European governments have already taken steps to prepare a no-deal exit. I mean, even before the previous deadline in March of this year. And so there's no really issue of a no-deal exit. A no-deal means no general deal, actually. It means plenty of very particular deals with all European countries in the end. And in a sense, the European Union has proved very efficient at dealing with such complex, labyrinthic issues in a certain sense. So there's really this political impasse on one side. On the other side, really, there's a lack of understanding of what a trade deal really is. And British politicians and economists were not really used to negotiating things like that. I mean, I've talked to many fellow economists and none of the past
But do we
few
already
years.
know, tell us the truth here, Rémi, do we already know what the contours of a future deal would be? Would it not have just been simpler to have the divorce bill and the trade deal at the same time?
Of course, I mean, everything should have been negotiating more or less at the same time, because it's both very political and very economic. So you can't just deal with some part and leaving the rest for later. That doesn't work that way. But that was exactly what was really the way it was really organized by the EU authorities also, really step by step. First the bill and then negotiating everything step by step. And that didn't work out at all. And we ended up with a deal that was just unacceptable on the part of the British Parliament. And that was not really surprising at all. There's also a strategy on part of some European governments to come to such an impasse and to show that there's no easy way out of the EU. So there are really a very complex political equation on all sides. It's not just discussed in Westminster. It's even more complex than that. So in a sense, I mean, no deal is not such a disaster, but we should have some time to prepare for it. If we said there's no way to achieve a deal, so let's take 2 years to prepare for it, for example, that wouldn't be a disaster at all in this case.
All right, not a disaster, except for two countries, Simon Breuer and Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, spelled it out. The two countries being Ireland and the UK. Can this border issue be fixed, like as Boris Johnson promises?
If that was an easy question to answer, we probably wouldn't in part be sitting here debating some of the issues that we have. I mean, I just want to come back to one thing: is that, this sort of notion of trade deals. I mean, I think as I sit here, I think if I pick up my Apple iPhone, until of late, I think the chips were designed in California, built in Japan, and assembled in China, and the EU doesn't have trade agreements with all three of those countries. So one can, exaggerate the importance of these trade deals. But I think as far as the Irish resolution or solution is that, clearly Boris Johnson's position and others is that, we've got borders like the US and Canada and others where, there's, technology that minimizes much of the friction. There has to be a certain amount of, trust, the trusted trader scheme. I'm no expert on this whole subject, but, it does require, a certain amount of, of goodwill and willingness, which hasn't been apparent, to date. So, is it fixable? ultimately, I think it is, but we aren't at a place yet where either side has a solution that is acceptable.
Monday evening in Derry, police staged a raid against a radical sectarian group called the New IRA. A crowd of several dozen protested. They threw petrol bombs at police vehicles. You can see that in these images here. Previously, homes had to be evacuated when a bomb was discovered nearby in a parked vehicle. Where you're sitting in London, Simon, is this a talking point at all?
I would say that it doesn't appear to have been a talking point as other issues are. So for the moment, no.
And is it a worry for you? Could we have a return to the bad old days?
Well, of course, I hope not, and I'm not sure that the forces are in place to recreate that that environment. So I would be very surprised.
All right, another moment that happened while they were waiting late into the night during that prorogation process for the Speaker to return from the House of Lords. You had Scottish National Party MP Hannah Bardell filming her colleagues with her phone, singing Scots Whahae. Not always in tune, by the way. To which Welsh MPs answered with their rendition of Callan Lan. Maybe we could hear a bit of that. Duncan FAIRGRIEVE, a bit of folklore, and we've learned who are the better singers between the Welsh and the Scottish. But there's a more serious point in all this, which is that, is there a chance that we could see the United Kingdom come under strain? And I mean, some have talked about a breakup. Is that too far-fetched?
I mean, I think that is a likely scenario, unfortunately.
A likely scenario?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is quite a likely scenario in the midterm because, as we all know, the Scottish population were not in favour of leaving, and the current chaotic handling by the Westminster Parliament just, I think, probably they feel that has proved them right. And the nationalists are clearly going to benefit from this. I think the Conservative Party are going to have a very difficult election north of the border. It's going to be an uphill struggle for them vis-a-vis the Scottish nationalists. So, that will no doubt take us towards sooner or later a second referendum on the independence of Scotland. So, what is going on at the moment, as I said, a projection mainly of the internal difficulties of the Conservative Party is sending out seismic waves across the UK and its constitution. And the reckless approach of the current leaders of the Conservative Party are I think, to blame for the consequences that occur.
Rémi BOURGEOT?
I mean, it's quite unbelievable to have such an escalation and such scenarios, I mean, which are realistic in a sense, I mean, far-fetched also to some extent, but it's quite unbelievable just because of the issue of Brexit. Negotiating Brexit in the end is to like 90% about preserving the relationship with the EU as it already is, to change a few things on immigration, for example, so some issues, but mostly it's about preserving the relationship, not changing things that much. But there's so much political division, so much political chaos in Britain, of course, but also in the EU. I mean, most countries are going through political crises that are at least as much as severe as in the UK in the end. So it's unbelievable that, I mean, European leaders, I mean, including UK leaders, are not able to come to a true negotiation, and that we see such scenarios develop and become more and more realistic.
Simon Breuer, the big argument against a second referendum once the final divorce deal is settled upon amongst the British is that it would be just a rekindling of the vitriol we saw in 2016. Yet, will there be just as much vitriol with a general election?
I think if British people, much as they probably don't want to go to the ballot box again, understand that we've reached this impasse and it needs to be resolved, and we're going to have an election to be able to resolve it once and for all. I think that that will be accepted, and people will go and vote and carry out their their duties, and voters they feel that they need to. So I do think that there is at this point of maximum acrimony, the extrapolations of the breakup of the union and then sort of almost the perpetual anger between these various parties, may be the wrong conclusion. We might look back in a year and find that we actually managed to get to an agreement, and that things look just a little bit calmer. And of course, at the same time, there is an assumption, but as the previous speaker just rightly commented, that all is stable, with the EU as a counterpart. But the reaction across Europe of displeasure has been about the growing power and centralization and lack of accountability of the EU, and this is not what people signed up for, and that isn't going away. So we have 28 people at this particular equation, and if the EU wants to recognize that the dissatisfaction is a result of the way they have approached their handling and their anti-democratic processes, and for those who haven't seen it, the BBC Fly on the Wall documentary, where you actually see one of the Europeans talking about the UK ending up as a colony, laughing and saying, well, that's what we wanted. I think that's symptomatic of that. The man and woman in the street feeling that the European officials are above them in terms of not being accountable, and look at the man and woman in the street with disdain.
Duncan FAIRGRIEVE?
I mean, isn't it paradoxical to hear lectures about the democratic process in the European Union when Parliament in the UK is suspended as of last night?
And we'll be back on October the 14th with that Queen's speech. I want to thank Simon Breuer for being with us from London. I want to thank Duncan FAIRGRIEVE, Rémi BOURGEOT. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.